I'm Victoria Hartwell, 28 years old, standing at my father Edmund's graveside in Millbrook Cemetery, while my entire world shatters around me. Not just from the devastating grief of losing the only parent who truly understood me, but from the venomous words my brother Nathaniel just spat in my face. "You're worthless, Victoria." Dad finally realized it too. "That's why you got nothing while I inherited everything that matters." The cruelty in his voice as mourners filed past us made my blood run cold. But what Nathaniel doesn't know, what nobody knows except me, is that folded in my purse right now is a deed that makes me the owner of everything he thinks he just inherited. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you're watching this, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. This story has an ending that will restore your faith in justice, and I promise you won't see it coming. The morning had started with the kind of gray October drizzle that seemed fitting for burying Edmund Hartwell, the man who had built Hartwell Properties from a single rental house into one of Millbrook's most successful real estate empires. As I stood in my black dress outside St. Andrew's Cathedral, greeting the steady stream of business associates, tenants, and family friends who had come to pay their respects, I kept searching the crowd for some sign of genuine grief that matched my own. My father had been more than just a parent to me. He had been my mentor, my closest confidant, and my business partner in everything but name. While other kids my age were partying through college, I had spent my weekends learning about property management, tenant relations, and real estate law from Dad. I knew the rental rates of every property in our portfolio, could recite the maintenance history of our apartment complexes, and had personally handled difficult tenant situations that would have overwhelmed someone twice my age. Nathaniel, on the other hand, had treated Dad's business success as nothing more than a personal ATM. At 32, my older brother had never held a real job for more than 6 months, preferring to live off the generous monthly allowances Dad provided while pursuing his ever-changing passions. First, it was becoming a professional photographer, then a food truck entrepreneur, then a cryptocurrency day trader. Each venture lasted just long enough for him to burn through thousands of Dad's dollars before moving on to the next get-rich-quick scheme. The difference in our relationships with Dad had become even more pronounced after Mom died in a car accident when I was 16. While I threw myself into helping Dad cope with his grief and learning everything I could about the business that had become his lifeline, Nathaniel seemed to resent any responsibility or emotional labor. He would disappear for weeks at a time, only surfacing when he needed money, or when Dad's latest health scare made him worry about his inheritance. But Dad never complained. He loved Nathaniel fiercely, despite everything, and always held out hope that his son would eventually find his way. "He just needs to mature," Dad would tell me when I expressed frustration at Nathaniel's latest financial disaster. "Everyone finds their path at their own pace, Vicky." During the church service, I delivered the eulogy I had spent days perfecting, sharing stories of Dad's generosity as a landlord who would personally fix elderly tenants' heat during blizzards, his mentorship of young real estate agents just starting their careers, and his quiet donations to Millbrook's homeless shelter that he never wanted publicized. My voice cracked as I described how he had taught me that real estate wasn't just about buildings and profit margins. It was about providing people with homes and being a positive force in the community. Nathaniel sat in the front pew throughout the service, checking his phone intermittently and wearing an expression of practiced solemnity that didn't quite reach his eyes. When the minister invited family members to speak, Nathaniel declined with a shake of his head, leaving me to represent our family's memories alone. After the burial service, as we gathered at Riverside Manor, the historic estate Dad had purchased and restored as both our family home and the crown jewel of his property empire, the mood was subdued but warm. Colleagues shared stories of Dad's business integrity, tenants spoke about his fairness and kindness, and city council members praised his contributions to Millbrook's downtown revitalization efforts. I moved through the gathering accepting condolences and sharing memories, grateful for the outpouring of support but feeling emotionally drained. That's when I noticed Nathaniel in the corner speaking quietly but intensely with Harold Pemberton, Dad's longtime attorney. Both men kept glancing in my direction, and something about their body language made my stomach clench with unease. As the afternoon wore on and guests began to leave, Harold approached me with an uncomfortable expression. "Victoria, could we speak privately for a moment? There are some matters regarding your father's estate that we need to discuss before the formal reading tomorrow." Nathaniel materialized beside us immediately, his earlier disinterest replaced by sharp attention. Perfect timing, Harold. I was hoping we could clear up some basic questions about Dad's will today. We moved into Dad's study, the room where I had spent countless hours learning about property law and business strategy. The walls were lined with real estate journals, legal texts, and framed photos of properties Dad had developed over the years. Seeing his reading glasses still folded on his desk made my throat tighten with fresh grief. Harold cleared his throat nervously. "I want to prepare you both for tomorrow's reading. There have been some significant changes to your father's will in recent months that may come as a surprise." Before Harold could continue, Nathaniel interrupted with barely contained excitement. "Changes that finally reflect reality, I assume. Dad came to understand that the family business should go to family. To his son, not his." He paused, looking at me with a coldness I had never seen before. "Not to someone who was never really cut out for this world anyway." The words hit me like a physical blow. Harold shifted uncomfortably, but my brother continued with growing confidence. "Let's be honest, Victoria. You've been playing dress-up in Dad's business for years. But real estate development isn't a game. It takes vision, risk-taking, leadership qualities that some people just don't possess." I stared at my brother in shock. This was a side of Nathaniel I had never seen. Calculating, cruel, and utterly convinced of his own superiority despite years of failure and dependence on Dad's support. "Tomorrow's reading will make everything official," he continued. "But Harold's right that we should prepare you. The properties, the business, the real assets, they're going where they belong. You'll be taken care of with some personal items and maybe a small cash settlement. But the Hartwell Properties empire needs to be run by a Hartwell man who understands what Dad really built here." As Nathaniel spoke, I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. Not just anger at his cruelty, but a grim satisfaction that he had no idea what was coming. Because tucked in my purse was a document that would change everything. A deed that Dad had placed in my hands just 3 weeks before his sudden heart attack, along with words I would never forget. "This is just the beginning, Vicky. Tomorrow will show him who really understood what I was building all along." Tomorrow's will reading was going to be very different from what my brother expected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My relationship with Dad began differently than most father-daughter bonds. When I was just 8 years old, I started following him around during his weekend property inspections, fascinated by how he could walk through a rundown building and envision its potential. While other kids were playing video games, I was learning to spot foundation issues and calculate square footage. Edmund Hartwell hadn't inherited his real estate empire. He had built it from nothing. Starting with a single duplex he bought with a VA loan after returning from military service, Dad slowly expanded his portfolio through careful investment and relentless hard work. By the time I was born, he owned 12 rental properties in Millbrook's historic district. By my 16th birthday, Hartwell Properties managed over 200 units across 3 counties. What made Dad special wasn't just his business acumen, but his genuine care for the people who lived in his properties. I remember being 10 years old and watching him personally install a new water heater for Mrs. Caldwell, an elderly widow who lived in one of our Garden Street apartments. When she apologized for not being able to pay the rent increase that other landlords in the area were demanding, Dad simply smiled and said, "Mrs. Caldwell, you've been a perfect tenant for 8 years. Your rent stays exactly where it is." That was the moment I understood that real estate could be about more than profit margins. Dad taught me that every property represented someone's home, someone's stability, someone's dreams. "We're not just landlords, Vicky," he would tell me. "We're stewards of people's most important investment, the roof over their heads." Nathaniel's relationship with Dad was entirely different from the start. Even as a young child, My brother showed little interest in the properties or the business. While I would spend Saturday mornings helping Dad review maintenance requests and tenant applications, Nathaniel would sleep until noon and then complain about being bored. When Dad tried to involve him in simple tasks like collecting rent checks or showing apartments to prospective tenants, Nathaniel would find excuses to avoid the work. The difference became even more pronounced after Mom's death. Caroline Hartwell had been the emotional anchor of our family, the one who balanced Dad's intensity with warmth and humor. When we lost her in that terrible accident on Highway 9, Dad threw himself into work as a way to cope with his grief. I followed his lead, finding comfort in the familiar routines of property management and the satisfaction of solving problems for our tenants. Nathaniel, however, seemed to view Mom's death as permission to abandon any pretense of responsibility. He started skipping school regularly, got involved with a crowd of kids who spent their time shoplifting and vandalizing property, and began demanding increasingly expensive allowances from Dad. When Dad tried to set boundaries or consequences, Nathaniel would explode in rage, sometimes disappearing for days at a time to stay with friends whose parents didn't ask questions. Despite Nathaniel's behavior, Dad never gave up on him. I watched my father endure years of disappointment, always hoping that his son would eventually mature and find his way. When Nathaniel announced he wanted to study film at an expensive private college, Dad paid the tuition without complaint. When he dropped out after 2 semesters to pursue his photography career, Dad bought him professional equipment worth thousands of dollars. When the photography venture failed, and Nathaniel decided to start a food truck business, Dad provided the startup capital. Each failure followed the same pattern. Nathaniel would become obsessed with a new idea, convince Dad to fund it, work enthusiastically for a few weeks or months, then lose interest when the reality of running a business proved more difficult than he had imagined. But instead of learning from these experiences, Nathaniel seemed to become more entitled with each failure, as if Dad's willingness to support him proved that he deserved success without effort. Meanwhile, I was quietly becoming indispensable to Hartwell Properties. By the time I graduated high school, I could handle tenant screening, coordinate repairs with contractors, and manage the complex scheduling required to maintain over 100 units. During college, where I studied business administration and real estate law, I would drive back to Millbrook every weekend to help Dad with paperwork and property inspections. After graduation, Dad offered me an official position as assistant property manager, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted me involved in the business, but he also worried about how Nathaniel would react to his little sister being given responsibilities that should have belonged to the family heir. "Dad," I told him during one of our evening walks around Riverside Manor's gardens, "I don't need a title or official recognition. I just want to help you build something that will last." That conversation seemed to unlock something in Dad's relationship with me. He began teaching me the deeper aspects of real estate investment, how to evaluate potential acquisitions, how to structure financing for major developments, how to navigate the complex regulations governing low-income housing projects. We would spend hours in his study, reviewing financial statements and discussing long-term strategies for expanding the business. It was during these sessions that I began to understand Dad's true vision for Hartwell Properties. He wasn't just building a rental empire. He was trying to revitalize Millbrook's downtown area and provide affordable housing options for working families, who were being priced out by developers from larger cities. His latest project, a plan to convert the abandoned Millbrook textile mill into mixed-income housing, represented years of careful planning and community engagement. "This is about legacy, Vicky," Dad explained one evening as we reviewed architectural plans for the mill conversion. "Not just financial legacy, but the kind of legacy that makes a community stronger. Anyone can buy properties and charge maximum rent. It takes vision to create something that serves both profit and purpose." Nathaniel remained oblivious to these conversations and plans. When he bothered to visit Riverside Manor, it was usually to ask for money or to complain about whatever crisis was currently disrupting his life. He showed no interest in Dad's health, which had been declining since a minor heart attack the previous year, and no curiosity about the business that funded his lifestyle. Looking back now, I realized that Dad was preparing me for something during those final months. He began insisting that I accompany him to meetings with the City Planning Commission, introduced me to his banker and attorney as his business partner, and made sure I understood every aspect of Hartwell Properties operations. At the time, I thought he was simply acknowledging my contributions to the company. No WhatsApps, I had no idea he was preparing me to take over everything. The last normal conversation I had with Dad was 3 weeks before his fatal heart attack. We were sitting in his study after reviewing applications for the mill conversion project, and he suddenly became very serious. "Vicky, there's something I need you to understand about families and business," he said, pulling a thick envelope from his desk drawer. "Sometimes the person who deserves to inherit isn't the person who expects to inherit. Sometimes blood isn't enough. It takes character, dedication, and genuine love for what you're building." He handed me the envelope with instructions not to open it unless something happened to him. "If that day comes," he said quietly, "remember that everything I've taught you is preparation for a reason. And remember that the best leaders are often the ones who never expected to lead." 3 weeks later, Dad collapsed in the mill building while inspecting the renovation progress. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was gone. And tomorrow Nathaniel was going to learn that expecting to inherit and deserving to inherit were two very different things. The stark differences between Nathaniel and me became impossible to ignore during our college years. While I was completing my business degree at Millbrook State University and spending every free moment learning about property law and real estate development, Nathaniel was burning through Dad's money at prestigious Ashford College, 3 hours away from home. Nathaniel had chosen Ashford specifically because it was far enough from Millbrook that Dad couldn't easily check on his progress. The tuition alone was $48,000 per year, not including his lavish apartment off campus, the brand new BMW Dad had bought him for graduation, and the generous monthly allowance that was supposed to cover basic living expenses but somehow never seemed to be enough. I learned about Nathaniel's college lifestyle through his social media posts, which painted a picture of endless parties, expensive restaurants, and spring break trips to places like Cabo and Miami. When I occasionally mentioned to Dad that maybe we should be concerned about Nathaniel's priorities, he would get that pained expression that told me the subject was off limits. "Your brother is finding himself," Dad would say diplomatically. "College is supposed to be about more than just academics. He'll settle down once he graduates and starts thinking seriously about his future." But I could see the worry lines deepening around Dad's eyes every time Nathaniel called asking for additional money, or when the credit card bills arrived showing charges at luxury stores and high-end nightclubs. Dad never complained directly, but I noticed him working longer hours and taking on additional consulting projects to cover the mounting expenses of Nathaniel's lifestyle. Meanwhile, I was building genuine expertise in every aspect of real estate management. Dad had started bringing me to quarterly meetings with his accountant, where I learned about cash flow analysis, depreciation schedules, and tax strategies for property investors. When our longtime maintenance supervisor Jimmy Rodriguez had his knee replacement surgery, I coordinated all the repair requests for 3 months, learning to negotiate with contractors and manage multiple projects simultaneously. The tenants began to know me by name. Mrs. Patterson in Building C would save her homemade cookies for my weekly inspection visits. The Rodriguez family in Unit 4B asked me to be their daughter's confirmation sponsor because, as Mr. Rodriguez explained, "You're the one who really takes care of us here." These relationships meant everything to me. They represented the human side of Dad's business philosophy that Nathaniel had never understood. When Nathaniel finally graduated from Ashford after 5 years and multiple major changes, Dad threw him an elaborate celebration party at the Millbrook Country Club. The event cost nearly $15,000 and included a catered dinner for 80 guests, an open bar, and a live jazz band that Nathaniel had specifically requested. I watched Dad beam with pride as he introduced his son to business associates and family friends, describing Nathaniel's film degree and his exciting plans for the future. Those exciting plans turned out to be a photography business that lasted 8 months. Nathaniel had convinced Dad to invest $25,000 in professional camera equipment, lighting systems, and a downtown studio space. For the first few weeks, Nathaniel threw himself into the venture with unusual enthusiasm, creating a website, printing business cards, and booking a few portrait sessions with family friends who were trying to be supportive. But as soon as Nathaniel encountered the reality of running a business, dealing with difficult clients, managing scheduling conflicts, handling the financial paperwork, and marketing his services to strangers, his interest began to wane. He started canceling appointments, showing up late for booked sessions, and spending more time complaining about the creative limitations of portrait photography than actually working. The final straw came when the Johnsons, longtime family friends who had hired Nathaniel to photograph their daughter's wedding, called Dad in tears because Nathaniel had simply not shown up. No phone call, no explanation, no apology. He had apparently decided that morning that wedding photography was, quote, beneath his artistic vision, and had gone to spend the weekend at a music festival instead. Dad was forced to personally refund the Johnsons' payment and pay for a replacement photographer, while also dealing with the embarrassment of his son's unprofessional behavior becoming gossip throughout Millbrook's close-knit business community. I watched my father age visibly during that crisis, his usual confidence shaken by the realization that Nathaniel's problems were becoming public in ways that could damage his own reputation. When Dad confronted Nathaniel about the wedding disaster, my brother's response was characteristic. He blamed everyone except himself. The clients had unrealistic expectations, the wedding photography market was oversaturated, and the pressure to succeed was stifling his creativity. Within a week, he had abandoned the studio and moved on to his next obsession, opening a gourmet food truck. The food truck venture followed an almost identical pattern. Dad provided the initial investment, $37,000 for a custom-built truck, commercial kitchen equipment, and licensing fees. Nathaniel spent weeks researching exotic cuisines and developing what he called a fusion concept that would revolutionize Millbrook's food scene. He hired a graphic designer to create an elaborate logo and branding package, leased space at the weekly farmers market, and even convinced Dad to attend the grand opening. For exactly 6 weeks, Nathaniel maintained his enthusiasm for the food business. He would wake up at 5 in the morning to prep ingredients, drive to various locations around town, and work 12-hour days serving customers. Dad was cautiously optimistic, telling me privately that maybe this time Nathaniel had found something that would stick. But the reality of the food service industry, the physical demands, the early hours, the need to maintain consistent quality while managing inventory and dealing with health inspectors, quickly overwhelmed Nathaniel's romantic vision of being a culinary entrepreneur. He began cutting corners on ingredients to save money, showing up late to scheduled locations, and eventually started hiring temporary workers to run the truck while he pursued other interests. The food truck business collapsed when Nathaniel failed to renew his health department permits and received multiple violations for unsanitary conditions. Once again, Dad was left to clean up the mess, paying outstanding debts to suppliers and dealing with angry customers who had prepaid for catering services that were never delivered. By this point, I had graduated with my business degree and was working full-time as Dad's unofficial assistant manager. I had my own office at Hartwell Properties headquarters, handled all the administrative aspects of our largest apartment complexes, and was actively involved in evaluating potential new acquisitions. While Nathaniel was bouncing from one failed venture to another, I was building genuine expertise and earning the respect of our tenants, contractors, and business associates. The contrast was becoming impossible for Dad to ignore, though he continued to make excuses for Nathaniel's behavior. When my brother announced his latest plan, becoming a cryptocurrency day trader, Dad's reaction was more subdued than usual. The initial investment was only $15,000, but I could see that Dad's patience was finally beginning to wear thin. Nathaniel's cryptocurrency phase lasted 4 months and ended predictably when he lost most of his trading capital in a series of impulsive investments based on social media tips and YouTube tutorials. This time, instead of asking Dad for more money to continue trading, Nathaniel announced that he was taking a break from entrepreneurship to, quote, focus on personal development, which translated to spending his days at the gym, playing video games, and dating a series of women who were impressed by his family's wealth, but unaware of his complete lack of personal income. During this period, I began to notice subtle changes in how Dad spoke about the future of Hartwell Properties. Instead of referring to, quote, when Nathaniel takes over the business, he started using phrases like, when the next generation assumes leadership, or when it's time to pass the torch. He began including me in strategic planning sessions with his attorney and accountant, asking for my input on major decisions and treating me as a genuine business partner rather than just a helpful daughter. The most telling moment came during a family dinner at Riverside Manor, about 6 months before Dad's death. Nathaniel had been describing his latest idea, a consulting business that would help other young entrepreneurs avoid the mistakes he had made in his previous ventures. As he outlined his plan with typical enthusiasm and complete lack of self-awareness, I watched Dad's expression grow increasingly pained. After dinner, as we were clearing the dishes, Dad pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Vicky," he said quietly, glancing toward the living room where Nathaniel was sprawled on the couch scrolling through his phone. "Do you think a person can change their fundamental character, or are we just who we are?" It was a question that revealed everything about Dad's internal struggle. He loved Nathaniel unconditionally, but he was finally beginning to understand that love alone couldn't transform his son into the responsible leader that Hartwell Properties needed. "I think people can grow and learn," I replied carefully, "but only if they really want to change and they're willing to do the hard work that change requires." Dad nodded slowly, staring out the kitchen window at the property that represented his life's work. "That's what I thought," he said finally. "That's exactly what I thought." Dad's first heart attack happened on a Tuesday morning in March, while he was reviewing construction proposals for the Millbrook textile mill conversion in his home office. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a strange thudding sound, followed by an ominous silence. When I called out to ask if everything was okay, there was no response. I found him collapsed beside his desk, clutching his chest and struggling to breathe. His face was gray, and sweat was pouring down his forehead despite the cool morning air. In that terrifying moment, as I called 911 and tried to keep him conscious until the paramedics arrived, I realized how much our family had been taking his strength and permanence for granted. The emergency room doctors at Millbrook General Hospital explained that Dad had suffered what they classified as a moderate heart attack. The main coronary artery had been partially blocked, but they had been able to clear it with emergency angioplasty. Dr. Harrison, the cardiologist, was cautiously optimistic but stern about the necessary lifestyle changes. "Mr. Hartwell, you're 58 years old, which means you're young enough to recover completely from this," Dr. Harrison explained as we sat in the cardiac unit later that afternoon. "But this is your heart's way of telling you that something needs to change. We're talking about stress reduction, dietary modifications, regular exercise, and most importantly, learning to delegate responsibilities instead of carrying everything yourself." Dad nodded dutifully at the doctor's instructions, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Hartwell Properties was in the middle of its most ambitious expansion phase, with the textile mill conversion representing a $2 million investment that required his constant oversight. 3 other major projects were in various stages of development, and Dad had been working 12-hour days for months to manage all the moving pieces. I immediately took a leave of absence from my graduate coursework in real estate law to help manage his recovery and keep the business running. For the first 2 weeks after his heart attack, I essentially lived at the hospital and then at Riverside Manor, handling phone calls from contractors, meeting with city planning officials, and managing the day-to-day operations of our rental properties. Nathaniel's response to Dad's medical crisis revealed everything about his character. When I called to inform him about the heart attack, he was in Las Vegas for what he described as a, quote, business conference, but which seemed to involve mostly gambling and nightclub appearances based on his social media posts. His first question wasn't about Dad's condition or prognosis, but about whether this would affect his monthly allowance. "I'm in the middle of some important networking opportunities out here," Nathaniel explained when I suggested he should come home immediately. "Dad would understand that I can't just drop everything. Besides, he's got you there to handle all the medical stuff, and I'd probably just be in the way." It took him 4 days to finally make the trip back to Millbrook, and when he did arrive, his visit lasted exactly 36 hours. He spent most of that time on his phone, coordinating with friends about weekend plans, and seemed genuinely annoyed by the restrictions on Dad's activity level. When Dad mentioned that he would need to make some significant changes to reduce his stress levels, Nathaniel's immediate concern was whether this meant selling off parts of the business. "If you're thinking about scaling back, you should definitely keep the most profitable properties," Nathaniel advised, as if he had any understanding of which properties were actually profitable. "Maybe sell off some of the smaller apartment buildings and focus on the commercial stuff. That way you can maintain the same income with less day-to-day hassle. I watched Dad's face carefully during this conversation. Nathaniel was essentially suggesting that Dad dismantle the affordable housing portfolio that represented the heart of his business philosophy, keeping only the high-end commercial properties that generated maximum profit with minimal community impact. It was clear that my brother had completely missed the point of everything Dad had built. Over the following weeks, as Dad slowly regained his strength, I took on an increasingly central role in managing Hartwell Properties. What had started as temporary crisis management evolved into a genuine partnership, with Dad teaching me the strategic aspects of real estate development that he had previously handled alone. We would spend hours each morning reviewing financial reports, discussing potential acquisitions, and planning the complex logistics of the textile mill conversion. Dad seemed energized by having someone who truly understood his vision, and I found myself learning at an accelerated pace as I took on responsibilities that would normally require years of experience to handle. The textile mill project became our shared obsession. The building had been abandoned for 15 years, but Dad saw its potential to become a mixed-income housing complex that would provide affordable units for working families, while also attracting young professionals to Millbrook's revitalizing downtown area. The project required navigating complex zoning regulations, coordinating with multiple city departments, and managing a construction timeline that involved historic preservation requirements. During one of our evening planning sessions, about 2 months after his heart attack, Dad made a comment that seemed casual at the time but would later prove significant. "You know, Vicky, I'm starting to think this health scare might be the best thing that ever happened to Hartwell Properties," he said, reviewing architectural drawings for the mill's interior layout. "Not the heart attack itself, obviously, but the way it's forced me to really evaluate what this business could become, with fresh leadership and new perspectives." I asked what he meant, and Dad was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately," he said finally. "Not just financial legacy, but the kind of legacy that actually makes a difference in people's lives. The mill conversion, the affordable housing initiatives, the community development projects, these aren't just business ventures. They're about creating something that will matter long after I'm gone." He paused, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The question is whether the next generation of leadership will understand that vision and have the commitment to see it through, or whether they'll just view this as a collection of assets to be maximized for profit." During this same period, Nathaniel's behavior became increasingly problematic. Instead of stepping up to help during Dad's recovery, he seemed to view the situation as an opportunity to extract additional financial support while Dad was emotionally vulnerable. He began making regular requests for money, claiming that he needed capital for a new business venture that would finally make him financially independent. The new venture was supposedly an online consulting business, where Nathaniel would share his expertise about entrepreneurship with other young business owners. He had created a website and social media presence promoting himself as a serial entrepreneur and business transformation specialist, conveniently omitting the fact that all of his previous businesses had failed spectacularly. When Dad questioned the viability of this latest plan, Nathaniel became defensive and manipulative. "I thought you'd be supportive of me finally finding my calling," he said during one particularly tense family dinner. "This is my chance to prove that all those other ventures were just learning experiences leading up to this moment. But if you're not willing to invest in your own son's success, I guess I understand where your priorities are." I watched this conversation with growing anger. Nathaniel was essentially emotionally blackmailing our father, who was still recovering from a heart attack, by suggesting that Dad's love and support should be measured by his willingness to fund another doomed business venture. Dad predictably agreed to provide the requested funding, but I could see the toll these interactions were taking on his health. His blood pressure would spike during conversations with Nathaniel, and he often seemed exhausted and discouraged after my brother's visits. It was during this time that Dad began having conversations with Harold Pemberton, his attorney, about updating his estate planning documents. He mentioned these meetings casually, explaining that his health scare had reminded him of the importance of having everything properly organized. "Just standard stuff," he told me when I asked about the meetings. making sure all the legal documentation is current and reflects my actual wishes for how things should be handled if anything happens to me. What I didn't realize at the time was that Dad was struggling with an impossible decision. His heart attack had forced him to confront the reality that Nathaniel might inherit a business empire without having the character, skills, or commitment necessary to preserve what had taken decades to build. The final piece of Dad's crisis came 3 months after his heart attack, when Nathaniel's online consulting business collapsed amid accusations of fraud from several clients, who claimed he had taken their money without providing any actual services. Instead of addressing these allegations or taking responsibility for his actions, Nathaniel simply shut down the website and social media accounts, leaving angry customers with no way to contact him for refunds. When Dad learned about this latest disaster through a heated phone call from one of the affected clients, I watched something fundamental shift in his expression. For the first time in Nathaniel's 32 years of disappointments, Dad seemed to truly understand that his son's problems weren't just a matter of immaturity or bad luck. They were character flaws that weren't going to improve with time or additional chances. That evening, Dad asked me to join him for a walk around the Riverside Manor grounds. "Vicky," he said as we paused beside the garden that Mom had planted years earlier, "I need to ask you a serious question, and I need you to give me a completely honest answer." I nodded, sensing the gravity of the moment. "If something happened to me tomorrow, do you believe you could run Hartwell Properties in a way that would honor everything we've built together? Not just the financial success, but the community impact and the responsibility to our tenants?" I thought carefully before responding. "Yes, Dad, I do believe that. But more importantly, I want that responsibility. This business isn't just a job for me, it's a calling." Dad smiled for the first time in weeks. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say," he replied. "And that's exactly why I've been making some very important decisions about the future." In the months following Dad's heart attack, our relationship transformed from father-daughter to genuine business partners in ways that felt both natural and profound. What had started as crisis management during his recovery evolved into a sophisticated collaboration that brought out the best in both of us. Dad began delegating major responsibilities to me with increasing confidence. When the Millbrook City Council requested a comprehensive presentation about the textile mill conversion project, Dad asked me to take the lead role in preparing and delivering the proposal. Standing before 12 council members and a packed gallery of community members, I outlined our vision for transforming the abandoned mill into housing that would serve both working families and young professionals while preserving the building's historic character. The presentation was a complete success. Councilmember Janet Walsh, who had initially been skeptical about private development in the historic district, publicly praised our commitment to affordable housing and community engagement. By the end of the meeting, we had received unanimous approval for the project, along with a commitment of municipal support for infrastructure improvements. After the meeting, as we walked to the parking lot, Dad put his arm around my shoulders with obvious pride. "Vicky, I couldn't have done that better myself," he said. "Actually, I don't think I could have done it as well. You understand the community impact of this project in ways that really resonate with people." These moments of recognition meant everything to me, but they also created a growing tension within our family dynamic. While Dad and I were building something extraordinary together, Nathaniel seemed increasingly resentful of what he perceived as my interference in family business matters. The tension came to a head during a family dinner in late summer, about 6 months after Dad's heart attack. Nathaniel had arrived unexpectedly, claiming he wanted to spend more time with Dad during his recovery, but it quickly became clear that he was actually concerned about the changes he was observing in how Dad spoke about the business. "I've been hearing some interesting things around town," Nathaniel said, cutting into his steak with unnecessary force. "People are talking about Victoria like she's running Hartwell Properties now. I hope you're not giving people the wrong impression about the family hierarchy here." Dad set down his fork and looked directly at Nathaniel. "What kind of wrong impression would that be?" "Well, obviously Victoria has been helpful while you've been recovering," Nathaniel replied, his tone becoming more aggressive. "But I wouldn't want our business partners and tenants to start thinking that she's actually in charge of major decisions. That could create confusion about succession planning and family leadership roles." I felt my face flush with anger, but Dad held up a hand to indicate I should let him respond. Nathaniel, Victoria has been making major decisions for Hartwell Properties for the past 6 months, Dad said calmly. She secured approval for our largest development project, negotiated 3 major lease renewals, and managed a construction crisis that could have cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars. If people think she's in charge of important matters, it's because she is. Nathaniel's expression darkened. Dad, I think your health situation might be affecting your judgment here. Victoria is great at administrative stuff, but real estate development requires experience and leadership qualities that take years to develop. You can't just hand over major responsibilities to someone because they're good at paperwork. The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. Dad's jaw tightened, and I could see him struggling to control his temper. What specific experience do you bring to real estate development? Dad asked quietly. What leadership qualities have you demonstrated that would make you better qualified to handle these responsibilities? Nathaniel seemed genuinely surprised by the question. I'm your son, he said, as if that answered everything. This business was built for family legacy. I may not have been directly involved in the day-to-day operations, but that's because I was developing other skills and gaining broader business experience. What broader business experience? I asked, unable to stay silent any longer. Your photography business that lasted 8 months? The food truck that failed health inspections? The consulting company that ended with fraud allegations? Nathaniel turned on me with fury. At least I was building something of my own instead of just riding on Dad's coattails. Everything you've accomplished has been handed to you because you happen to live at home and don't have your own life. Dad slammed his hand on the table, making the glasses jump. That's enough. Victoria has earned every responsibility she's been given through competence, dedication, and genuine care for what we're building here. If you want to be involved in this business, you need to prove you deserve that involvement through your actions, not your birth certificate. The dinner ended in uncomfortable silence, with Nathaniel leaving early and making pointed comments about needing to, quote, think seriously about the family dynamics here. But his departure seemed to liberate Dad from some internal constraint he had been carrying. Over the following weeks, Dad began including me in conversations and decisions that went far beyond day-to-day property management. He introduced me to his financial advisor as his business partner and likely successor, brought me to meetings with major contractors as an equal participant rather than an assistant, and started asking for my input on strategic decisions about the long-term direction of Hartwell Properties. The most significant change came when Dad asked me to represent the company at the annual Millbrook Business Council's Leadership Conference. This was a prestigious event where local business owners presented their company's visions for community development and economic growth. Dad had been a featured speaker for the past 5 years, but this year he wanted me to take his place. My presentation focused on sustainable real estate development that balanced profit with community impact. I outlined our philosophy of creating housing that served diverse income levels, our commitment to preserving historic buildings while adapting them for modern use, and our vision for downtown revitalization that wouldn't displace existing residents. The response was overwhelmingly positive. 3 other business owners approached me after the presentation with proposals for collaborative projects, and the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce invited me to join their Economic Development Committee. More importantly, several longtime clients of Hartwell Properties specifically mentioned how impressed they were with my knowledge and vision for the company's future. When I returned home that evening, Dad was waiting in his study with a bottle of champagne and an expression of profound satisfaction. I got 6 phone calls this afternoon from people who attended your presentation, he said, pouring 2 glasses. Every single person said the same thing, that you demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and vision that Millbrook needs for its continued growth. As we toasted the successful presentation, Dad became unexpectedly serious. Vicky, I need you to understand something important. What's happening between us isn't just about business succession or family dynamics. You're becoming the leader that Hartwell Properties needs to fulfill its potential. And that's something that can't be taught or inherited. It has to be earned. He paused, looking at me with an intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable. There are going to be some significant changes coming in how this business is structured and managed. Changes that reflect the reality of who has actually been building our future rather than who might have expected to inherit it. I asked what he meant by significant changes, but Dad just smiled mysteriously. All in good time, he said. But I want you to know that everything I'm planning is designed to ensure that Hartwell Properties continues to serve this community the way it was meant to, regardless of what anyone else might expect or demand. During this same period, Nathaniel's visits to Riverside Manor became increasingly infrequent and tense. When he did appear, usually unannounced and often needing money for some new crisis, his interactions with Dad were strained and formal. He seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the family dynamic, but he couldn't quite identify what had changed or how to address it. The most telling incident occurred in early fall, when Nathaniel arrived during one of our weekly business planning sessions. Dad and I were reviewing architectural drawings for a potential second phase of the textile mill development, discussing how to incorporate additional affordable housing units while maintaining the project's financial viability. Nathaniel walked into the study without knocking and seemed genuinely surprised to find us engaged in detailed planning discussions. "Oh, I didn't realize you were having a business meeting," he said, clearly expecting to be invited to join the conversation. Dad looked up from the drawings. "Victoria and I have business meetings every Tuesday evening. It's been our routine for the past several months." "I could sit in if you want a fresh perspective," Nathaniel offered, but his tone suggested he expected rather than requested inclusion. "That won't be necessary," Dad replied firmly. "Victoria and I have this handled." I watched Nathaniel's face cycle through confusion, hurt, and finally anger, as he realized he was being excluded from discussions about the family business. But instead of asking how he could become more involved or what he could do to earn a place in these conversations, he simply turned and left without another word. That night, Dad and I stayed up late finishing our planning session, but the elephant in the room was Nathaniel's obvious resentment of our partnership. "He's never going to accept this," I said finally. "No matter how well things go or how successful we are, Nathaniel is always going to believe he deserves to inherit this business, simply because he's your son." Dad nodded thoughtfully. "I know. And that's exactly why I've been making some very careful preparations to ensure that what we're building together can't be undone by entitlement or resentment." He pulled out his desk drawer and showed me a business card for Amanda Sterling, an estate planning attorney from the larger city of Brookhaven, about an hour away from Millbrook. "I've been working with someone outside our usual legal circle," Dad explained. "Someone who specializes in complex succession planning for family businesses where the obvious heir might not be the right choice." I felt a chill of anticipation mixed with anxiety. "Dad, what exactly are you planning?" He smiled with the same mysterious expression I had seen earlier. "Justice," he said simply. "I'm planning justice." Dad's second heart attack happened on a freezing February morning, while he was inspecting the nearly completed textile mill renovation. I was at the Hartwell Properties office reviewing lease applications when I received the call from Miguel Santos, our lead construction foreman. "Miss Victoria, you need to get down here right away." Miguel's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Your father collapsed in the mill building. The paramedics are on their way, but it doesn't look good." I arrived at the construction site before the ambulance, finding Dad unconscious on the concrete floor of what would have been the building's main lobby. His face was blue-gray, and he wasn't breathing on his own. Miguel and two other workers had performed CPR until the paramedics arrived, but everyone could see this was far more serious than his previous heart attack. The emergency room team at Millbrook General worked on Dad for over 2 hours while I sat in the waiting room, making the terrible phone calls that no daughter ever wants to make. I reached Nathaniel on his 4th ring. He was at a ski resort in Colorado with friends, celebrating what he called a business networking retreat that appeared to be mostly about expensive restaurants and après-ski parties. "How serious is it this time?" Nathaniel asked, and I could hear laughter and music in the background. "I mean, he bounced back fine from the last one." "Nathaniel, they've been working on him for 2 hours," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "This isn't like before. You need to come home immediately." "I'll see what I can do about getting a flight," he replied, but his tone suggested this was more of an inconvenience than a family emergency. Keep me posted on any major developments. Dr. Harrison found me in the waiting room just after midnight. His expression told me everything before he spoke a word. Miss Hartwell, I'm so very sorry. We did everything possible, but the damage to your father's heart was too extensive. He passed away at 11:47 p.m. The next several hours passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and impossible decisions. Dad was gone at 59 years old, just 11 months after his first heart attack, and I was completely alone in dealing with the immediate aftermath. Nathaniel didn't arrive in Millbrook until Thursday afternoon, 3 days after Dad's death, claiming that bad weather had delayed his flights and that he had needed time to, quote, process the shock before traveling. When he finally appeared at Riverside Manor, Nathaniel seemed more focused on the practical implications of Dad's death than on grieving our loss. His first question wasn't about funeral arrangements or how I was coping, but about whether I had contacted Harold Pemberton about the will reading. We should probably get that scheduled as soon as possible, Nathaniel said, settling into Dad's favorite armchair with disturbing ease. I know you've been handling a lot of the day-to-day business stuff, but now we need to think about the formal transition of ownership and management responsibilities. I stared at my brother in disbelief. Dad died 3 days ago, Nathaniel. Can we at least get through the funeral before we start talking about business transitions? Of course, he said, though his tone suggested he thought I was being overly emotional. I just want to make sure we handle everything properly. Dad worked too hard building this empire to let administrative delays cause problems now. Over the next several days, as I arranged Dad's funeral and dealt with the dozens of condolence calls from business associates, tenants, and community leaders, Nathaniel's behavior became increasingly problematic. He seemed to view Dad's death as his opportunity to finally claim what he believed was rightfully his, and his comments grew more presumptuous each day. I've been thinking about some changes we could make to improve profitability, he told me while I was writing Dad's obituary. Some of these older apartment buildings aren't generating optimal returns. We could probably sell them and reinvest in higher-end commercial properties. When I pointed out that those older apartment buildings provided affordable housing for working families and represented Dad's core mission, Nathaniel waved dismissively. Dad was too sentimental about that stuff, he said. A business needs to be run like a business, not a charity. Once I take over, we're going to focus on maximizing returns for the ownership. The casual way he said "once I take over" sent a chill through me, but I was too exhausted from grief and funeral planning to engage in an argument about something that would presumably be resolved by Dad's will. The funeral service at St. Andrew's Cathedral was standing room only, with over 300 people attending to honor Dad's memory. I delivered another eulogy, this time focusing on Dad's vision for community development and his belief that business success should benefit everyone, not just property owners. As I spoke about his commitment to affordable housing and his mentorship of young entrepreneurs, I could see many people in the congregation wiping away tears. Nathaniel sat in the front pew looking appropriately solemn, but I noticed him checking his phone several times during the service and whispering with his girlfriend Rebecca, who had flown in from Colorado to attend the funeral. When the minister invited family members to speak, Nathaniel again declined, leaving me to represent our family's memories and values alone. After the burial at Millbrook Cemetery, we returned to Riverside Manor for the reception. The house filled with conversations about Dad's impact on the community, his business integrity, and his genuine care for the people who rented his properties. Multiple tenants approached me to share stories about Dad's kindness during difficult times, waiving rent when someone lost a job, personally fixing emergency repairs, helping families find larger apartments when they outgrew their current spaces. Your father was more than a landlord, Mrs. Chen from Garden Street Apartments told me, tears in her eyes. He was a friend who happened to own our building. There aren't many people like that in this world. These conversations reminded me why Dad's work had meant so much to him, and why preserving his legacy was about more than just maintaining profitable properties. But they also highlighted the stark contrast between Dad's values and Nathaniel's apparent plans for the business. Late in the afternoon, as the reception was winding down, Harold Pemberton arrived to pay his respects. He had been attending a legal conference in the state capitol and had driven directly to Millbrook after learning about Dad's death. Harold looked genuinely grief-stricken as he offered his condolences and shared memories of their 20-year friendship. "Your father was one of the most principled businessmen I ever knew," Harold told me. "He never made a decision without considering how it would affect the people involved, not just the bottom line." Nathaniel appeared beside us as Harold was speaking, extending his hand with confident familiarity. "Harold, good to see you again," Nathaniel said, though I couldn't remember the last time they had actually interacted. "I know this isn't the appropriate time for business discussions, but I wanted to let you know that I'm ready to move forward with whatever transition procedures need to happen." Harold looked uncomfortable. "Well, we should schedule a formal reading of the will for early next week. There are some complexities that need to be addressed in a proper legal setting." "Complexities?" Nathaniel asked, and I could hear tension creeping into his voice. "What kind of complexities?" Dad always told me the estate planning was straightforward. "We'll discuss everything at the appropriate time," Harold replied diplomatically. "But I should mention that there have been some recent changes to Edmund's will that you both should be prepared for." Nathaniel's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment. "What kind of changes?" "Changes that reflect your father's evolving understanding of what would be best for Hartwell Properties and the community it serves," Harold said carefully. "But really, this isn't the time or place for these discussions. Let's schedule the reading for next Tuesday at 2 p.m. After Harold left, Nathaniel was unusually quiet for the rest of the evening. I could see him processing Harold's cryptic comments about complexities and recent changes, and his earlier confidence seemed shaken. But by the next morning, he had apparently convinced himself that any changes to Dad's will would be minor adjustments that wouldn't affect the basic inheritance structure. Dad probably just updated some of the specific bequests or charitable donations, he told me over breakfast. Maybe he left you a larger cash inheritance, or some additional personal items. But the core business assets, the properties, the development projects, the real value, that has to go to family leadership. I nodded non-committally, but something about Harold's demeanor the previous evening had suggested that the changes were far more significant than Nathaniel imagined. Dad had spent months working with Amanda Sterling, the estate planning attorney from Brookhaven, on what he had described as, quote, complex succession planning. I had a growing suspicion that those plans were designed to protect everything we had built together from exactly the kind of profit-focused transformation that Nathaniel was already describing. The weekend passed slowly, with both of us lost in our own thoughts about what Tuesday's will reading might reveal. Nathaniel seemed to be mentally preparing for his role as the new owner of Hartwell Properties, making lists of potential changes, and calling friends to share his excitement about finally stepping into the family business. I spent those days walking through the properties Dad and I had worked on together, saying goodbye to the partnership that had meant everything to me, and trying to prepare myself for whatever revelations awaited us in Harold's office. Neither of us had any idea that Dad's final surprise would change everything we thought we knew about family, inheritance, and justice. The weekend between Dad's funeral and the scheduled will reading felt like the longest 2 days of my life. While I tried to process my grief and handle the endless stream of business calls from contractors, tenants, and suppliers who needed guidance during the transition, Nathaniel was busy conducting what he called preliminary assessments of the Hartwell Properties portfolio. Without asking for my input or permission, he had begun scheduling meetings with real estate appraisers, commercial property brokers, and investment advisors. I discovered this on Saturday morning when I found him in Dad's study, surrounded by property files, and speaking animatedly on the phone with someone about maximizing asset values during the transition period. "What are you doing with Dad's files?" I asked after he ended his call. "Just getting organized," Nathaniel replied, not looking up from the financial documents spread across Dad's desk. "I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with here. Some of these properties haven't been properly evaluated in years." I noticed he had pulled out files for some of our most successful affordable housing complexes, including the Garden Street apartments and the Riverside townhomes, properties that Dad had been particularly proud of because they provided quality housing for working families at below-market rates. "Those properties are performing exactly as Dad intended them to," I said, feeling defensive. "They're not about maximum profit. They're about community impact. Nathaniel finally looked up, his expression mixing pity with condescension. Victoria, I know Dad taught you to think that way, but sentiment doesn't pay for property maintenance or generate returns for reinvestment. A business has to be sustainable, which means every asset needs to justify its place in the portfolio. Before I could respond, his phone rang again. As he answered, I heard him say, "Yes. I'm definitely interested in exploring conversion options for the Garden Street property. Mixed-use commercial and high-end residential could probably triple the revenue stream." I felt sick. Garden Street Apartments housed 24 families, including several elderly tenants who had lived there for over a decade, and young families who were saving money to buy their first homes. Dad had deliberately kept the rents affordable, because he believed stable housing was the foundation of community stability. When Nathaniel ended his call, I confronted him directly. You can't just start making plans to sell or convert Dad's properties before we even know what's in his will. I'm not making plans, Nathaniel said defensively. I'm gathering information so I can make informed decisions once the ownership transfer is official. That's called responsible business management. But his definition of gathering information apparently included sharing detailed financial data about our properties with outside parties and discussing potential sales strategies. Over the weekend, I received 3 phone calls from longtime tenants who had heard rumors that new management was planning to sell their buildings to developers. Mrs. Rodriguez from Building C was particularly distressed. Miss Victoria, is it true that you and your brother are selling our apartments? My neighbor heard from someone at the grocery store that new owners want to tear down the building and put up condos. I assured Mrs. Rodriguez that no decisions had been made about any properties, but I was furious that Nathaniel's preliminary assessments were already creating anxiety in our tenant community. When I confronted him about the rumors, he seemed genuinely surprised that his conversations with brokers and appraisers might become public knowledge. I specifically asked them to keep our discussions confidential, he said. How was I supposed to know that real estate people gossip? Sunday morning brought an even more troubling development. I was reviewing maintenance requests in the kitchen when Rebecca appeared, carrying a cup of coffee and looking unusually serious. She had been staying at Riverside Manor since the funeral, and I had assumed she was simply providing emotional support to Nathaniel during a difficult time. Victoria, can we talk privately for a moment? Rebecca asked, glancing toward the study where Nathaniel was having another phone conversation with potential property buyers. We walked out to the garden, and Rebecca's first words confirmed my growing suspicions about her real purpose for being there. I hope you understand that Nathaniel is just trying to honor your father's legacy by ensuring the business continues to grow and prosper, she began. He's been under a lot of pressure to step up and take responsibility for everything your father built. The carefully rehearsed quality of her words made it clear that she and Nathaniel had discussed how to manage my potential resistance to his plans. But what bothered me more was her assumption that Nathaniel's vision for growth and prosperity aligned with Dad's actual legacy. Rebecca, what exactly has Nathaniel told you about Dad's business philosophy? I asked. She looked confused by the question. Well, he said your father was very successful at building a real estate empire, but that he was probably too conservative in his investment strategies. Nathaniel thinks there are opportunities to expand more aggressively and generate higher returns by focusing on premium properties and commercial development. I realized that Nathaniel had completely misrepresented Dad's approach to Rebecca, describing his affordable housing commitment as mere conservatism, rather than deliberate social responsibility. She had no idea that Dad's conservative approach was actually a carefully considered strategy for community development. Has Nathaniel mentioned Dad's commitment to affordable housing? I pressed. Rebecca's blank expression told me everything. He said something about your father being sentimental about some of the older properties, but that successful businesses have to evolve beyond the founder's emotional attachments. That afternoon, while Nathaniel was out meeting with what he described as, quote, potential strategic partners, I made a decision that would prove crucial in the coming days. I drove to Dad's safety deposit box at Millbrook First National Bank, using the key I had discovered in his desk drawer, along with a note instructing me to, quote, review the contents before Tuesday's meeting with Harold. The safety deposit box contained several items that made my hands shake as I examined them. There was a sealed envelope addressed to me in Dad's handwriting, a second sealed envelope marked for Harold Pemberton to be opened only in Victoria's presence, and a small digital recorder with a note that said, play this if you need to understand what really happened during my final months. I didn't open the envelopes. Something told me to wait until after the will reading, as Dad's note had suggested. But I did listen to the recording, and what I heard made everything clear about Dad's recent behavior and Nathaniel's growing confidence about inheriting the business. Dad's voice on the recording was tired but determined. If Victoria is hearing this, then my suspicions about Nathaniel's true character have been confirmed. Over the past several months, my son has been pressuring me to change my estate planning in ways that would essentially dismantle everything I've spent my life building. The recording continued with details that shocked me. Nathaniel had apparently been having regular conversations with Dad about the inefficiencies in our business model, arguing that affordable housing was a waste of valuable real estate and that Dad's community-focused approach was preventing the family from achieving maximum wealth. Nathaniel has threatened multiple times to cut off all contact with me if I don't update my will to reflect what he calls business realities, Dad's voice continued. He's told me that maintaining affordable housing is a betrayal of family legacy, and that if I really loved him, I would ensure he inherits properties that can generate maximum returns rather than maximum social impact. But the most disturbing part of the recording was Dad's description of Nathaniel's manipulation tactics. My brother had apparently been researching the financial value of each property and presenting Dad with detailed analyses, showing how much money the family was losing by keeping rents below market rates. Nathaniel calculated that we could increase our annual revenue by 40% if we converted all the affordable housing units to market-rate rentals, Dad said. When I explained that this would displace dozens of families and undermine our community relationships, he said that successful businessmen can't afford to be sentimental about individual tenants. The recording ended with Dad's voice becoming stronger and more resolved. I've realized that giving Nathaniel control of Hartwell Properties would destroy everything I've worked to build. Not just the financial success, but the relationships, the community trust, and the social impact that make this business meaningful. That's why I've been working with Amanda Sterling to ensure that my real legacy goes to someone who understands what legacy actually means. As I drove back to Riverside Manor, I felt a strange mixture of validation and dread. Dad had clearly seen through Nathaniel's manipulative behavior and had taken steps to protect his true vision for the business. But I also realized that Tuesday's will reading was going to devastate my brother in ways that might destroy our family relationship forever. When I arrived home, I found Nathaniel in the living room with Rebecca, both of them looking excited and confident. He was showing her property photos on his laptop and describing his plans for what he called the Hartwell Properties transformation. We could probably double our rental income within 2 years if we focus on the right market segments, he was saying. Dad was too attached to being everyone's friend instead of running an efficient business. Hearing him dismiss Dad's community relationships as mere friendship rather than understanding their business value confirmed everything I had heard on the recording. Nathaniel truly believed that Dad's approach had been naive and inefficient, and he was eager to correct what he saw as decades of missed opportunities. Neither of them noticed me standing in the doorway, and I didn't announce my presence. Instead, I quietly went upstairs to my room, where I sat with Dad's sealed envelopes and tried to prepare myself for what tomorrow would bring. Tuesday's will reading was going to change everything, but I was beginning to understand that the changes might be even more dramatic than either Nathaniel or I had imagined. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of gray, oppressive sky that seemed to mirror my emotional state. I had barely slept, alternating between reading Dad's sealed letter and listening to his recording, trying to prepare myself for what Harold's will reading might reveal. Nathaniel, by contrast, seemed energized and confident, spending the morning making phone calls to what he described as key stakeholders, who needed to understand the transition timeline. At precisely 1:45 p.m., we arrived at Harold Pemberton's law office in downtown Millbrook. The brick building had housed the firm for over 50 years, and walking through its oak-paneled hallways felt like stepping back in time. Harold's secretary, Mrs. Langford, greeted us with the kind of formal sympathy that funeral directors and lawyers seemed to perfect over decades of practice. "Mr. Pemberton is waiting for you in the conference room," she said, leading us down a corridor lined with law books and framed diplomas. "Can I offer you coffee or water before we begin?" I accepted water, though my throat felt too tight to actually drink anything. Nathaniel declined refreshments, checking his watch with barely concealed impatience. Rebecca had offered to accompany him for moral support, But Harold had firmly explained that will readings were limited to direct beneficiaries and legal representatives. The conference room was exactly what you would expect from a small-town law firm. Burgundy leather chairs around a mahogany table, walls lined with legal volumes, and tall windows that looked out onto Millbrook's main street. Harold sat at the head of the table with a thick manila folder, and an expression that seemed oddly uncomfortable for someone who had handled dozens of estate settlements over his career. "Thank you both for coming," Harold began, adjusting his glasses and opening the folder. "Before we proceed with the formal reading, I want to acknowledge how difficult this process must be for you both, so soon after your father's passing." Nathaniel shifted impatiently. "We appreciate that, Harold, but we're ready to move forward with whatever needs to be done. Dad always told us he kept his estate planning straightforward and clear." Harold's expression grew even more uncomfortable. "Well, that's something we need to discuss. Your father's final will and testament, executed just 6 weeks before his death, contains some provisions that may come as a surprise to both of you." I felt my stomach clench. 6 weeks before Dad's death would have been right around the time he had given me the sealed envelope from his safety deposit box. "What kind of surprises?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Harold cleared his throat and began reading from the legal document. "I, Edmund Charles Hartwell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments and declare this to be my final will." The formal legal language continued for several minutes, covering standard provisions about debts, taxes, and funeral arrangements. Then Harold reached the section that would change everything. "To my son, Nathaniel Edmund Hartwell, I leave the sum of $50,000, my personal collection of books and fishing equipment, and my 1987 Ford pickup truck, with the hope that these items will remind him of the values I tried to instill but which he chose not to embrace." Nathaniel's face went completely white. "What did you just say?" Harold continued reading without looking up. "To my daughter, Victoria Hartwell, I leave the entirety of my real estate holdings, including all properties owned by Hartwell Properties LLC, Riverside Manor and its grounds, all business equipment and vehicles, and all remaining liquid assets, totaling approximately $4.2 million. The silence in the room was deafening. I stared at Harold in shock, unable to process what I had just heard. Nathaniel's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound was coming out. Harold set down the will and looked directly at Nathaniel. "Your father also included a personal letter explaining his decision, which I'm authorized to read aloud if you wish to hear it." "This is impossible," Nathaniel finally managed to say, his voice cracking. "There has to be some mistake. Dad would never— I'm his son. I'm his only son." "There's no mistake," Harold replied firmly. "I witnessed your father's signature myself, along with 2 other attorneys from my firm. He was completely lucid and adamant about these provisions." Nathaniel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I don't believe this. Victoria, did you know about this? Did you manipulate him somehow?" I found my voice, though it sounded distant to my own ears. "I had no idea, Nathaniel. I'm as shocked as you are." But even as I said it, I realized that wasn't entirely true. Dad's recent behavior, his mysterious meetings with Amanda Sterling, his comments about justice and, quote, ensuring the right person inherits, all of it suddenly made perfect sense. Harold pulled out a second document. "Your father asked me to read his personal explanation if there were any questions about his decision." Nathaniel collapsed back into his chair, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and devastation. Harold began reading Dad's letter in a measured tone. "To my children, if you are hearing this letter, it means I am gone and you are learning about my final decisions regarding the disposition of my life's work. I want you both to understand that these decisions were not made lightly or in anger, but after months of careful consideration about what would be best for the business I built and the community it serves." The letter continued with Dad's explanation of Nathaniel's behavior over the past year. The pressure to abandon affordable housing, the threats to cut contact if his inheritance expectations weren't met, and his complete disregard for the community relationships that were central to Hartwell Properties' mission. "Nathaniel, my son, I love you deeply, but I cannot in good conscience leave you control of something you have made clear you intend to dismantle," Harold read. Your vision of success involves maximizing profit at the expense of the people and principles that made this business meaningful. That is not legacy, that is destruction. Nathaniel's hands were shaking as he listened to Dad's words. "This isn't fair," he whispered. "I'm his flesh and blood, I'm his heir." Harold continued reading. "Victoria, my daughter, you have proven through your actions, your values, and your commitment that you understand what I was truly trying to build. The properties, the business relationships, and the community trust are safe in your hands because you see them as responsibilities, not just assets." As Harold read Dad's final words about hoping both his children would find happiness and purpose in their lives, I watched my brother's face transform from shock to fury. "You planned this," Nathaniel said, turning on me with venom in his voice. "You've been manipulating him for months, turning him against me, making yourself indispensable so you could steal what should be mine." "That's not true," I protested, but Nathaniel wasn't listening. "You always resented that I was Dad's real child, while you were just the helpful little assistant," he continued, his voice rising. "So you wormed your way into his business and poisoned him against his own son." Harold intervened firmly. "Mr. Hartwell, I understand you're upset, but these accusations are completely unfounded. Your father made these decisions independently, and frankly, the behavior he described in his letter matches exactly what I witnessed during our meetings." "What behavior?" Nathaniel demanded. Harold hesitated, then pulled out a third document. "Your father documented several conversations where you pressured him to change his estate planning, including threats to cut off contact if he didn't prioritize maximizing inheritance value over community impact." Nathaniel's face flushed red. "Those weren't threats. I was trying to help him understand business realities. Someone had to think about the family's financial future, instead of just being sentimental about tenants who don't even appreciate what they have. And there it is," Harold said quietly. "The exact attitude your father was concerned about." The meeting continued for another hour as Harold explained the legal procedures for transferring ownership, but I barely heard any of it. The enormity of what had just happened was overwhelming. I owned Hartwell Properties. All of it. The textile mill project, the affordable housing complexes, Riverside Manor, everything Dad had built was now my responsibility. As we prepared to leave, Nathaniel made one final attempt to challenge the will. "I'm going to contest this," he announced. "Dad wasn't in his right mind after his heart attack. Victoria took advantage of a sick old man, and I'm going to prove it." Harold's response was swift and definitive. "You're certainly entitled to contest the will, but I should inform you that your father anticipated that possibility. He had a complete psychological evaluation performed by Dr. Rebecca Matthews just 2 weeks before his death, specifically to document his mental competency. The results show he was completely lucid and capable of making these decisions." Nathaniel stared at Harold in stunned silence, realizing that Dad had thought of everything. As we walked out of the law office, the late afternoon sun was breaking through the gray clouds, casting long shadows across Millbrook's main street. Nathaniel stopped on the sidewalk and turned to face me, his expression a mixture of hurt and hatred that made my heart ache. "You're worthless, Victoria," he said, his voice cold and flat. "You always have been. Dad finally realized it too, which is why he left you a bunch of rundown apartment buildings while I got the real value." I stared at my brother in confusion. "Nathaniel, I inherited the entire business. You got $50,000. He laughed bitterly. "You think you got the business? You got the headaches. You got the maintenance costs, the difficult tenants, the regulatory compliance, the endless problems that Dad was too stubborn to solve properly. I got liquid assets and freedom." His delusion was so complete that I couldn't even respond. Harold had just read a will that left me $4.2 million in properties and assets, while Nathaniel received what amounted to a modest farewell gift, yet somehow he was convincing himself that he had gotten the better deal. "Enjoy your inheritance," Nathaniel said as he walked toward his car. "When those properties start costing you more than they're worth, don't come crying to me for help." As I watched him drive away, I realized that this was probably the last conversation we would ever have as siblings. The brother I had grown up with was gone, replaced by someone so consumed with entitlement and resentment that he couldn't even recognize reality when it was read to him by a lawyer. Standing alone on the sidewalk outside Harold's office, holding the keys to my father's entire life's work, I felt the crushing weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Dad had trusted me with everything he had built, and now I had to prove that his faith in me was justified. The first 3 weeks after the will reading were the most overwhelming period of my life. While I should have been celebrating Dad's incredible gift of trust and responsibility, I found myself drowning in a sea of legal procedures, business decisions, and emotional isolation that left me questioning whether I was truly capable of preserving his legacy. The immediate aftermath was a bureaucratic nightmare. Transferring ownership of 47 properties, updating insurance policies, changing bank account authorizations, and notifying every vendor, contractor, and business partner about the ownership change required endless paperwork and appointments. Harold had provided me with a detailed checklist of necessary procedures, but every completed task seemed to generate 3 new requirements. More challenging than the paperwork was the sudden realization that I was now responsible for the livelihoods of over 300 tenant families and 12 full-time employees. Every maintenance request, every lease renewal, every hiring decision fell on my shoulders. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, especially when I was still processing my grief over losing Dad and the complete destruction of my relationship with Nathaniel. Miguel Santos, our lead construction foreman, had been particularly concerned about the transition. During our first official meeting as owner and employee, he expressed worries that had been shared by several other longtime staff members. "Miss Victoria, we all respect you and know how hard you've worked alongside Mr. Edmund," Miguel said carefully. "But some of the guys are worried about whether you'll keep the same policies about overtime pay, health benefits, and job security. There's been talk around town that new ownership sometimes means changes to employee agreements." I assured Miguel that I had no intention of changing Dad's generous employee policies, but his questions highlighted a problem I hadn't anticipated. While I understood the business operations, I was still learning about the complex web of relationships, expectations, and unwritten agreements that made Hartwell Properties function smoothly. The tenant community presented its own challenges. Mrs. Chen from Garden Street had called 3 times in the first week, concerned about rumors that the new management would raise rents or sell the building to developers. Several families had begun looking for alternative housing, afraid that Dad's death meant the end of the affordable rent stability they had enjoyed for years. "I don't want to seem ungrateful," Mrs. Patterson from Building C explained during one of her visits to my office. "But we're scared. Your father always treated us like family, but we know business isn't family. If you need to raise our rents to market rates, we understand, but we need time to prepare." These conversations broke my heart. Dad's tenants were living in fear because they couldn't believe that his values would survive his death. Their assumption that I would prioritize profit over people showed how rare Dad's approach had been, but it also meant I had to prove myself worthy of their trust all over again. The business side was equally daunting. The textile mill conversion project was entering its final phase, but the contractor had discovered structural issues that would require an additional $180,000 in unexpected repairs. The City Planning Committee was demanding updated environmental impact studies for our proposed second-phase development. 3 major commercial tenants were requesting lease renegotiations that could significantly impact our cash flow. Each decision felt enormous. Dad had made these kinds of judgments look effortless, but I found myself second-guessing every choice, worried that one wrong decision could damage the business he had spent decades building. I would sit in his study, now my study, surrounded by files and contracts, paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake that would prove Nathaniel right about my incompetence. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Dad had been my mentor, my business partner, and my closest friend. Losing him meant losing the one person who understood both the challenges I was facing and the vision I was trying to preserve. I had no one to discuss major decisions with, no one to provide guidance when contractors presented conflicting recommendations, no one to reassure me that I was interpreting Dad's wishes correctly. My social life had essentially disappeared. Friends from college would call occasionally, but how could I explain that I was now responsible for a multi-million-dollar real estate empire while grieving my father and dealing with my brother's hatred? Their concerns about dating and career advancement seemed trivial compared to deciding whether to approve a $200,000 capital improvement loan for the Riverside townhomes. Sleep became elusive. I would lie awake at night reviewing the day's decisions, wondering if I had handled tenant complaints appropriately, whether I had negotiated fair contracts with suppliers, or if my employee management style was too inexperienced for the responsibilities I had inherited. The financial pressure was constant. While the business was profitable, it operated on thin margins that required careful management of cash flow, maintenance costs, and capital improvements. 3 weeks after the will reading, I received a call that pushed me to my breaking point. Harold Pemberton's secretary informed me that Nathaniel had filed a formal contest of Dad's will, claiming that I had exercised undue influence over a mentally compromised man and that the inheritance was the result of financial elder abuse. The legal papers arrived by certified mail the next morning. Reading Nathaniel's allegations felt like being physically assaulted. According to his attorney's filing, I had systematically isolated Edmund Hartwell from his son while manipulating his medical condition and emotional vulnerability to secure an inheritance that violated natural family succession rights. The document claimed that I had, quote, deliberately undermined the father-son relationship by poisoning Edmund Hartwell against his male heir, and that Dad's decision to leave the business to me was clear evidence of diminished mental capacity influenced by a manipulative daughter figure who exploited her caregiving role for financial gain. Every allegation was a lie, but they were crafted in legal language that made my loving relationship with Dad sound sinister and calculated. The papers demanded a complete psychiatric evaluation of Dad's mental state during his final year, a forensic accounting of all business transactions I had been involved in, and testimony from family members and employees about my quote, pattern of manipulation and control. I called Harold immediately, but his response was less reassuring than I had hoped. Victoria, I want you to understand that these contests are routine when there's a significant inheritance dispute, he said. Nathaniel's claims are baseless, and we have extensive documentation of your father's mental competency and decision-making process. But fighting this will take time, money, and emotional energy. It could drag on for months or even years. The prospect of spending years defending myself against accusations that I had manipulated and abused my father was devastating. Even if I ultimately won the contest, the legal process would consume my time, drain the business resources, and damage my reputation in the community where I needed to maintain trust and credibility. That evening, sitting alone in Riverside Manor, I experienced what could only be described as a complete crisis of confidence. The house felt enormous and empty without Dad's presence. The responsibility of managing hundreds of people's housing security felt overwhelming. The legal battle ahead seemed insurmountable. For the first time since Dad's death, I seriously considered whether Nathaniel might be right. Maybe I was in over my head. Maybe the business would be better off with someone who had more experience. Maybe Dad had made a mistake trusting me with something so important. I found myself in Dad's study, staring at the framed photo of the Garden Street Apartments ribbon-cutting ceremony from 5 years earlier. Dad was beaming with pride as he handed keys to the Martinez family, the first tenants to move into the renovated building. Mrs. Martinez was crying with joy, holding her infant daughter while her husband shook Dad's hand. Looking at that photo, I remembered why Dad had loved this work so much. It wasn't about the money or the properties or even the business success. It was about providing families with safe, affordable homes and being part of a community that supported each other through difficult times. But remembering Dad's passion only made my current situation feel more hopeless. How could I live up to his legacy when I was barely managing to keep up with the daily responsibilities? How could I fight a legal battle while learning to run a complex business? How could I prove to myself, to the community, and to the courts that I deserved the trust Dad had placed in me? I pulled out the sealed envelope Dad had left in his safety deposit box, the one marked, "For Victoria's eyes only." I had been saving it for a moment when I truly needed guidance, and that moment had clearly arrived. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope, hoping that Dad's final words might provide the strength and wisdom I desperately needed to face whatever was coming next. Dad's final letter was written in his careful handwriting on personal stationery, dated just 2 days before his fatal heart attack. As I unfolded the pages in the lamplight of his study, I could almost hear his voice speaking the words that would change everything about how I viewed my situation. My dearest Victoria, if you are reading this letter, then 2 things have happened. I am gone, and you are questioning whether you have the strength to carry forward what we built together. I know this because I know you. You have always been your own harshest critic, always worried about living up to expectations, rather than recognizing how far you exceed them. Tears were already streaming down my face as I continued reading. I want you to understand that choosing you as my successor was not an act of faith or hope. It was a recognition of what you had already proven. Every major success Hartwell Properties achieved in our final years together came from your insights, your relationships with our community, and your understanding of what business with integrity actually means. Dad's letter continued with specific examples I had forgotten. How my suggestion to partner with the Millbrook Community College for a workforce housing program had resulted in our most successful development project. How my relationships with long-term tenants had prevented 3 potential lawsuits. How my financial analysis had identified cost savings that improved our profitability by 15% without raising rents. You have been running this business alongside me for 2 years, Vicky. The transition isn't about learning to be a leader, it's about recognizing that you already are one. But the next section of Dad's letter contained information that stopped me cold. By now, Nathaniel has likely filed a legal challenge to my will. I want you to know that I anticipated this possibility and took steps to protect both you and the business from his attempts to claim what he never earned. In the safety deposit box, you will find a second envelope marked Legal Protection. Open it only if you need evidence to defend against Nathaniel's accusations. With shaking hands, I set down Dad's letter and retrieved the second envelope from the safety deposit box contents I had brought home. Inside were documents that made me gasp in shock. The first was a series of photographs taken with what appeared to be a hidden camera, images of Nathaniel in Dad's study, going through financial files and business documents without permission. The timestamps showed these had been taken during several of Nathaniel's visits over the past year, when he claimed to be simply spending time with Dad during his recovery. Each photo showed Nathaniel systematically photographing property records, tenant information, and financial statements with his phone. In one particularly damning image, he was clearly copying bank account numbers and investment portfolio details onto a notepad. The second document was even more shocking, a complete transcript of recorded conversations between Dad and Nathaniel during the months following Dad's heart attack. Dad had apparently been recording their interactions after becoming suspicious of Nathaniel's true motives. Reading through the transcripts was like watching my brother transform into a stranger. In conversation after conversation, Nathaniel pressured Dad to change his business approach, threatening emotional abandonment if Dad didn't prioritize maximizing inheritance value over community impact. If you really loved me, you'd ensure I inherit properties that can generate maximum returns rather than this sentimental affordable housing nonsense, Nathaniel had said during one recorded conversation. I'm your only son, your blood heir. These tenants aren't family. They're customers who've been taking advantage of your soft heart for years. When Dad tried to explain his philosophy about business responsibility to the community, Nathaniel's response was brutal. Dad, you're getting old, and frankly, your judgment isn't what it used to be. You need to think about legacy and family wealth, not playing social worker for people who don't appreciate what you've given them. But the most devastating transcript was from a conversation just 3 weeks before Dad's death. Nathaniel had apparently come to Riverside Manor specifically to pressure Dad about estate planning. I've been talking to some financial advisors about the best way to structure the inheritance, Nathaniel had said. They agree that keeping all these low-income properties is basically charity work that's preventing the family from building real wealth. If you leave everything to me, I can sell off the underperforming assets and reinvest in high-yield commercial real estate. Dad's response, according to the transcript, was quiet but firm. Nathaniel, what you're describing would displace hundreds of families and destroy relationships I've spent decades building. That's not legacy. That's betrayal of everything I've worked for. That's exactly the kind of sentimental thinking that's holding our family back financially, Nathaniel had replied. Business isn't about feelings, Dad, it's about results. If you can't see that, maybe Victoria has been influencing your judgment more than you realize. The transcript showed Dad ending that conversation abruptly, but it was followed by a handwritten note. This was the moment I knew Nathaniel would never understand what I actually built here. The next day, I contacted Amanda Sterling about finalizing the will changes. The third document in the envelope was a complete psychological evaluation performed by Dr. Rebecca Matthews, the psychiatrist Harold had mentioned. The assessment was incredibly thorough, including cognitive testing, memory evaluation, and detailed analysis of Dad's decision-making capacity. Dr. Matthews' conclusion was unambiguous. Edmund Hartwell demonstrates complete mental competency and sophisticated understanding of complex business and family dynamics. His decisions regarding estate planning reflect careful consideration of long-term consequences and deep knowledge of the individuals involved. There is no evidence of diminished capacity, undue influence, or impaired judgment. But the final document in the envelope was the most surprising of all, a complete recording of a meeting between Dad and Amanda Sterling, where they discussed strategy for protecting the business from potential legal challenges. Mr. Hartwell, I want to ensure you understand the potential consequences of disinheriting your son in favor of your daughter, Amanda's voice said on the recording. Are you prepared for the possibility that he will claim undue influence or mental incompetency? Dad's response was clear and strong. Ms. Sterling, my son has spent the past year trying to convince me that my life's work is worthless sentiment. He has shown complete disregard for the community relationships that make this business meaningful, and has repeatedly threatened to cut off all contact if I don't structure my will to maximize his financial inheritance. Victoria, on the other hand, has proven through her actions that she understands both the business and social responsibility aspects of what I've built. This isn't about family favoritism. It's about ensuring that my legacy serves the purpose for which it was created. As I finished reviewing all the evidence Dad had carefully compiled, I felt a transformation taking place within me. The self-doubt and overwhelming anxiety that had consumed me for weeks was replaced by a growing sense of clarity and determination. Dad hadn't just left me his business. He had armed me with everything I needed to defend it. Every piece of evidence, every recorded conversation, every document was designed to protect me from exactly the kind of legal attack Nathaniel had launched. But more importantly, Dad's careful preparation showed me that he had complete confidence in my abilities. He hadn't left me the business hoping I would grow into the role. He had left it to me because I had already proven I was the right person to preserve and continue his legacy. I returned to Dad's letter to read his final paragraphs. Victoria, there will be moments when you question whether you're strong enough or smart enough or experienced enough to handle the responsibilities I've left you. In those moments, remember that strength isn't about never feeling overwhelmed. It's about continuing to do the right thing even when it's difficult. Remember that intelligence isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions and listening to the people who depend on you. Remember that experience isn't just about time. It's about learning from both successes and mistakes. You already possess everything you need to succeed. Trust your instincts, honor our shared values, and never forget that the best leaders are those who see their power as a responsibility to serve others, rather than an opportunity to serve themselves. I am so proud of the woman you have become, and so confident in the leader you will continue to be. Make decisions with your heart as well as your head. Treat people with the dignity they deserve. And remember that true success is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. All my love and faith in you, Dad. I sat in Dad's study until dawn, reading through every document, listening to every recording, and absorbing the full scope of what he had prepared for this moment. By the time the sun rose over Millbrook, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Essen, the scared, overwhelmed young woman who had been questioning her competence, was gone. In her place was someone who understood that she had been chosen not because of family connections or sentimental favoritism, but because she had already proven herself worthy of the trust. It was time to show Nathaniel, the legal system, and the entire community that Dad's faith in me was completely justified. The next morning, I called Harold Pemberton's office before 8 a.m. and scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. When I arrived at his law firm carrying a briefcase full of Dad's evidence, Harold took one look at my expression and knew something had changed fundamentally. "Victoria, you look different," he said as we settled into his conference room. "More determined." "I found Dad's insurance policy," I replied, opening the briefcase and laying out the photographs, transcripts, and recordings. "Everything we need to not just defend against Nathaniel's challenge, but to destroy it completely." Harold's eyes widened as he examined the evidence. The photos of Nathaniel secretly copying business records were damning enough, but the recorded conversations were devastating. As Harold listened to the audio of Nathaniel threatening to cut contact unless Dad prioritized family wealth over sentimental charity work, his expression grew increasingly grim. "This is extraordinary," Harold said after reviewing everything. "Your father documented a clear pattern of coercion and manipulation. These recordings show that Nathaniel was the one exercising undue influence, not you." We spent the next 3 hours developing our counter-strategy. Instead of simply defending against Nathaniel's accusations, we would file our own motion demonstrating that his will contest was frivolous and motivated by greed, rather than legitimate concerns about Dad's mental state. "I want to schedule a hearing where all this evidence becomes part of the public record," I told Harold. "Not just to win the case, but to make sure everyone in Millbrook understands exactly who Nathaniel is and what he was trying to do to Dad's legacy." Harold smiled with satisfaction. "That can definitely be arranged. Judge Morrison handles probate cases, and she has no patience for frivolous inheritance disputes. When she sees this evidence, Nathaniel's case will be dismissed so fast it will make his head spin." The hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. Word spread quickly through Millbrook's close-knit community that the Hartwell inheritance dispute would be decided in open court, and by Thursday evening it was clear that the courtroom would be packed with interested observers. I spent the week before the hearing doing something that felt even more important than preparing legal strategy. I visited every Hartwell Properties location and spoke directly with our tenants and employees about the future of the business under my leadership. At Garden Street Apartments, I called a meeting with all 24 tenant families to address their concerns about potential rent increases or building sales. "I want you to understand something clearly," I told the group assembled in the community room. "This business was built on the principle that everyone deserves safe, affordable housing, and that principle will not change under my ownership. Your rents will remain stable, your maintenance concerns will be addressed promptly, and any future development will prioritize community benefit over maximum profit." Mrs. Rodriguez raised her hand. "Miss Victoria, we heard that your brother wanted to sell our building to developers. Is that true?" I decided they deserved complete honesty. "Yes, it's true. My brother had plans to convert affordable housing units to high-end rentals and sell properties to commercial developers. That's exactly why my father chose to leave the business to someone who would preserve his vision rather than profit from dismantling it." The relief in the room was palpable. Several families had been living in fear for weeks, and knowing that their housing security was protected allowed them to relax for the first time since Dad's death. I held similar meetings at each of our major properties, and the response was overwhelmingly supportive. Tenants who had known me since childhood expressed confidence in my leadership, and several offered to testify on my behalf if needed during the legal proceedings. The employee meeting at our main office was equally encouraging. Miguel Santos spoke for the entire construction crew when he said, "Miss Victoria, we've watched you work alongside Mr. Edmund for years. We know you understand this business and care about doing things the right way. If you need us to tell the court about your qualifications, we'll be there." By the day of the hearing, I had a clear understanding of the community support behind my leadership, which gave me confidence that went far beyond legal preparation. Friday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine, as if the weather itself was celebrating the coming vindication. The courthouse was indeed packed, with tenants, employees, business associates, and curious community members filling every available seat. Nathaniel arrived with his attorney, a sharp-dressed lawyer from the state capitol who clearly specialized in inheritance disputes. My brother looked confident and well-prepared, wearing an expensive suit and projecting an air of righteous indignation that I knew would appeal to anyone who didn't know the real story. Judge Morrison called the hearing to order and asked Nathaniel's attorney to present his case first. The lawyer launched into a polished presentation about undue influence by a manipulative daughter figure who isolated a vulnerable elderly man from his natural heir. For 20 minutes, Nathaniel's attorney painted me as a scheming opportunist who had exploited Dad's grief and medical vulnerability to steal an inheritance that rightfully belonged to his son. The accusations were smoothly delivered and might have been convincing to anyone who didn't know the actual facts. When Harold stood to present our defense, the mood in the courtroom shifted immediately. He began by playing selected excerpts from Dad's recorded conversations with Nathaniel, letting my brother's own words demonstrate who had actually been manipulative and coercive. The first recording was Nathaniel's threat to cut contact unless Dad structured the will to maximize inheritance value. The second was his dismissive description of affordable housing tenants as people taking advantage of Dad's soft heart. The third was his plan to sell off underperforming assets and reinvest in high-yield commercial properties. By the time Harold finished playing the recordings, several people in the courtroom were visibly angry, and Nathaniel was slumped in his chair looking pale and defeated. Harold then presented the photographs of Nathaniel secretly copying business records and financial information, explaining that these images showed a pattern of deceptive behavior designed to gain unfair advantage in inheritance planning. Judge Morrison examined each piece of evidence carefully before addressing Nathaniel directly. "Mr. Hartwell, these recordings suggest that you were the one exercising undue influence over your father, not your sister. You appear to have threatened emotional abandonment unless he structured his will according to your financial preferences. How do you respond to that evidence?" Nathaniel's attorney tried to object, but Judge Morrison cut him off. "I want to hear from Mr. Hartwell himself." Nathaniel stood shakily. "Your Honor, those conversations were taken out of context. I was just trying to help my father understand business realities and make smart financial decisions for the family. By threatening to cut off contact if he didn't prioritize your inheritance over community service," Judge Morrison asked sharply. "I never threatened him," Nathaniel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Judge Morrison played another excerpt where Nathaniel explicitly said, "If you can't structure this inheritance properly, maybe I need to reconsider how much time I spend visiting you." "That sounds like a threat to me," Judge Morrison said coldly. "And frankly, the evidence suggests that your father made exactly the right decision about who should inherit his business." She then called me to the witness stand to testify about my relationship with Dad and my qualifications to run Hartwell Properties. For 30 minutes, I described my education, my work experience, my relationships with tenants and employees, and my commitment to preserving Dad's vision for community-focused real estate development. Several community members were then called to testify about my character and competence. Miguel Santos spoke about my leadership during construction projects. Mrs. Chen described how I had helped her family during a financial crisis. The president of the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce testified about my contributions to community development planning. By contrast, when Nathaniel's attorney tried to find character witnesses for his client, they discovered that virtually no one in the community was willing to testify on his behalf. His pattern of failed businesses and his reputation for taking advantage of Dad's generosity had left him with no credible supporters. After hearing all the evidence, Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and decisive. This court finds that Edmund Hartwell was completely competent when he executed his final will and testament. The evidence shows that his decisions were based on careful consideration of his children's character, qualifications, and commitment to his business values. Furthermore, the evidence suggests that Mr. Nathaniel Hartwell was the party attempting to exercise undue influence through emotional manipulation and threats. She turned to look directly at Nathaniel. "Your inheritance contest is not only without merit, it is frivolous and appears to be motivated by greed rather than legitimate concern for your father's wishes. The contest is hereby dismissed with prejudice, and you are ordered to pay all court costs and reasonable attorney fees incurred by the estate in defending against this baseless challenge." The courtroom erupted in applause as Judge Morrison's gavel came down. Tenants, employees, and community members stood to show their support for the decision, while Nathaniel sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that his manipulation had not only failed, but had been exposed publicly for everyone to see. As we left the courthouse, Harold put his hand on my shoulder. "Victoria, that was a complete vindication, not just legally, but morally. Your father would be incredibly proud of how you handled yourself today." Outside the courthouse, dozens of people approached to congratulate me and express their relief that Hartwell Properties would continue operating according to Dad's principles. The overwhelming community support made it clear that I had not just won a legal battle. I had earned the trust and respect necessary to truly carry forward Dad's legacy. Nathaniel walked past without making eye contact, his expensive lawyer hurrying him toward a waiting car. For a moment, I felt genuine sadness for my brother. His greed and entitlement had cost him not just his inheritance, but his relationship with his family and his standing in the community where he had grown up. But that sadness was quickly replaced by a sense of profound responsibility and excitement about the future. I now had the legal authority, community support, and personal confidence necessary to not just preserve what Dad had built, but to expand it in ways that would serve Millbrook for generations to come. 1 year after Dad's death, I stood in the main lobby of the completed Millbrook textile mill conversion, watching families move into their new homes and feeling the profound satisfaction that comes from honoring a legacy while building something entirely your own. The building hummed with life. Children playing in the courtyard, young professionals heading to work, elderly residents sitting on benches sharing stories with neighbors they had just met. The textile mill project had become everything Dad had envisioned and more. 48 affordable housing units housed working families who had been priced out of other developments, while 24 market-rate condominiums attracted young professionals who wanted to live in Millbrook's revitalizing downtown area. The ground floor housed small businesses, a coffee shop, a daycare center, a community health clinic, creating exactly the kind of mixed-use development that strengthened neighborhoods rather than displacing existing residents. More importantly, the project had established a template for community-focused development that other cities were beginning to study and replicate. I had been invited to speak at 3 real estate conferences about sustainable development that balances profit with social responsibility, and Hartwell Properties was gaining recognition as a model for ethical business practices in an industry often criticized for prioritizing profit over people. The financial success had exceeded even Dad's optimistic projections. By maintaining our commitment to affordable housing while strategically adding market-rate properties, we had increased our annual revenue by 32%, while actually improving our relationships with both tenants and the broader community. It turned out that doing the right thing was also excellent business strategy. Our tenant retention rate was 94%, our properties had waiting lists, and our reputation for integrity attracted the highest quality renters and business partners. But the personal growth had been even more significant than the business success. The scared, overwhelmed young woman who had questioned her abilities in Dad's study was gone, replaced by someone who made difficult decisions with confidence, who built coalitions to solve complex problems, and who understood that true leadership meant empowering others rather than controlling them. My management style had evolved into something that honored Dad's values while reflecting my own personality. I held monthly meetings with tenant representatives from each property, ensuring that our residents had direct input into maintenance priorities and community policies. I had implemented a profit-sharing program for employees that rewarded both individual performance and collective success. Most importantly, I had established the Edmund Hartwell Foundation, which provided down payment assistance for first-time homebuyers and scholarships for students pursuing careers in community development. The Foundation's first major project was a partnership with Millbrook Community College to create a construction trades program that would train local residents for jobs in sustainable building practices. Miguel Santos had agreed to serve as the program's director, bringing his decades of experience to a new generation of workers who would help build Millbrook's future. As I walked through the textile mill's corridors, greeting new residents and checking on move-in progress, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day at Dad's funeral, when Nathaniel had called me worthless. The cruel irony was that his insult had been delivered at the exact moment when I was holding the deed to everything he thought he deserved, a moment that perfectly captured the difference between entitlement and earning. I had not seen or spoken to Nathaniel since the courthouse hearing, though I heard occasional updates about his life through mutual acquaintances. After the humiliating public exposure of his manipulation, he had left Millbrook and moved to Arizona, where he was apparently working in sales for a large real estate firm. The reports suggested he was competent at his job, but unremarkable, a far cry from the business empire he had expected to inherit. Part of me felt genuinely sad about the complete breakdown of our sibling relationship. Despite everything that had happened, I had loved the brother I grew up with, even if that person had been replaced by someone consumed with greed and resentment. But I had also learned that you cannot maintain relationships with people who view your success as their failure, who see your happiness as evidence of unfairness in the world. The most important lesson I had learned was that family is defined by values and actions rather than genetics. The real family of Hartwell Properties included Miguel and his construction crew, Mrs. Chen, and the other longtime tenants who had become my advisors and advocates, Harold Pemberton, and the other professionals who had supported Dad's vision, and the dozens of community members who had rallied around our mission during the legal battle. These relationships were built on mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Everything that had been missing from my relationship with Nathaniel. Blood might create obligations, but it takes choice and commitment to create real family bonds. The afternoon of the textile mill's official opening celebration, I found myself back in Dad's study, my study now, reviewing the speech I would give at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The room had evolved to reflect my leadership while honoring his memory. His favorite books and fishing trophies remained, but I had added photos of our recent projects, community awards we had received, and letters from tenants expressing gratitude for affordable housing that had changed their lives. As I practiced my speech, I came across the final paragraph I had written to close the ceremony. My father, Edmund Hartwell, taught me that success in business cannot be measured only by financial returns, but by the positive impact we have on the communities we serve. Today, as we celebrate this project's completion, we are not just opening a building. We are opening doors of opportunity for families who deserve safe, affordable homes, and for a community that deserves development, guided by integrity rather than greed. Real estate development at its best is about creating foundations, not just for buildings, but for families, for communities, and for future generations who will inherit the consequences of the decisions we make today. That is the legacy my father built, the responsibility I have inherited, and the mission that will guide Hartwell Properties for generations to come. Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and the last guest had gone home, I walked through Riverside Manor's gardens, where Dad and I had shared so many conversations about business, community, and life. The house no longer felt empty or overwhelming. It felt like home, filled with memories of lessons learned and dreams yet to be realized. I pulled out my phone and recorded a video message that I would post on Hartwell Properties' social media channels the next morning. If you're watching this, you probably know the story of how I inherited my father's real estate business under unusual circumstances. What you might not know is the most important lesson that experience taught me. Worth is not determined by what people say about you in your darkest moments, but by what you do when given the opportunity to prove them wrong. My brother called me worthless at our father's funeral, apparently not realizing that I was holding the deed to everything he thought he would inherit. But his cruelty was also his gift to me, because it forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, and to build a life based on earning respect rather than expecting it. Whether you're dealing with family betrayal, professional setbacks, or people who underestimate your abilities, remember that other people's limitations are not your limitations. Their lack of vision is not your lack of potential. Their inability to see your worth is not evidence that you lack worth. Build something meaningful, treat people with dignity, and never let anyone convince you that kindness is weakness or that integrity is naive. The best revenge against people who call you worthless is living a life of such value that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Thank you for following this journey with me, and remember, your worth is not determined by what others inherit, but by what you choose to build. As I ended the recording and looked up at the stars above Millbrook, I felt Dad's presence in the evening breeze and heard his voice in the sounds of a community settling in for the night. I had not just preserved his legacy, I had expanded it, strengthened it, and ensured that it would continue serving families and building communities long after my own time had passed. That night, I slept peacefully in the house where I had learned that inheritance is not about what you receive, but about what you do with the gifts you are given. And I had finally, fully proven myself worthy of the greatest gift of all, the trust of a father who saw in me not just his daughter, but the future leader his life's work deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.